let's begin. We need to know our water history to save our water future, really. The policy decisions of the past affect our opportunity for the future. And so we're going to speak about pioneers of engineering and water policy and politics, most importantly, William Mulholland, who not only designed and created one of the most effective water transportation systems in human history, but also designed the failed St. Francis Dam in San Francisco Canyon, California, that had significant impacts on Ventura County. Now, I won't be intending to disparage William Mulholland through the discussion, but we will discuss his history, including his successes, his failures, and really association with individuals that did terrible things. And bad things certainly did happen in California's water policy history. People were misled to obtain water rights from them for the city of Los Angeles. Indigenous people lost their land and their livelihood. An entire lake that human beings depended on was emptied. We created the largest source of dust pollution in the United States in draining Owens Lake in the Eastern Sierra. But we also created a metropolis in Los Angeles that couldn't have otherwise existed. And I'll leave it to you to decide what's right and wrong. After all, that is policy. Well, and this really wasn't a first. Humans have been moving water for thousands of years. Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither were their incredible aqueducts. In fact, they took around 500 years. Unfortunately, we also created an incredible system of misuse of water by the distance of aqueduct, creating an out of sight, out of mind mentality. Los Angeles now has as much water as they need without seeing the deleterious effects of what they were doing in the early 20th century in creating the Los Angeles Aqueduct. Draining Owens Lake changed the entire climate in the area. And then after that, they went after Mono Lake, which is north of Owens, the lake you see behind me now. Now, California, we're really not concerned with rainfall. We don't collect it well, we don't bank it well, and frankly, we're terrible at both. What we're concerned with is snowfall. That is really what says whether we're in a drought or not. The Eastern Sierra Mountain Range, the Sierra Nevada Mountain Range, which benefits the Southland from the eastern side, and the western slope, which benefits the Central Valley, really ensure human survivability and proliferation for now. How we use and preserve the water is of utmost importance. The Central Valley in California is the breadbasket of the world. We employ, feed, and develop in untold proportions in this area as a result of the watershed from the Sierra Nevada and previously from groundwater in that area. And disputes do rage about the appropriateness of water usage in the Central Valley. Are we supporting food supplies for the world, small farmers, or conglomerates from outside of California that seek to obtain pecuniary value by harvesting water through unnatural waterways that leave devastating effects to land and environment behind? So should LA, an absolute desert, have palm trees? Should there be abundant grass, landscaping an area that exists only to please the fleeting eye of a passing motorist? Or should the Owens Valley be repopulated with water, rivers, and estuaries that historically served the area, while Los Angeles and other basins ration water for necessary uses, improve their aged water infrastructure, and collect rainwater in reasonable form to feed the need of an ever-growing city? Have we done wrong? Los Angeles and Los Angeles Aqueduct users, often unknowingly for this generation, gentrified an area and created an us versus them approach to living in a humane civilization. Should the rich have incredibly manicured estates while the destitute have little access to water, life-sustaining water? Should water cost this much? The further we move it, the more it costs. It's plain and simple, it's economics. And next up is desalinization. Now, frankly, water isn't cheap, and we force you to work. If we force you into work in business centers that exist only because water was diverted there, is that fair to human beings? Has water created the housing affordability crisis, or has it exacerbated it? Have we removed the ability of low-income humans from earning livings in areas with naturally occurring water by taking water, moving them to city centers where they must now fight for a livelihood designed by someone who says they must? And so let's explore that. So I'll share my screen. Let's see, we're just 3 years into a pandemic and I'm still making sure I can share my screen. Okay.
Chris, it's the center of the screen at the bottom, the green button.
Yeah, is it not sharing?
I don't think so, not yet.
Just a moment.
Okay, let's try now.
Okay. Okay. Give me just a minute. This was such a riveting talk, and now my computer doesn't want to share screens.
It's still riveting.
Thank you. Hang on real quick. Okay. I'm going to take the easier approach to this. I'm going to email the presentation to Dr. Khan, and he'll share it for me. Okay. Well, we can at least begin. So while I wait for that to transmit, again, right, so many years into a pandemic, and I'm just figuring out Zoom. Good for me. Just real quick, so just dynamics for how this is going to work. What we're going to do, we're only going to speak until about 6:15. So you're only really bearing with me for another 35 minutes here. So we have an opportunity to have a discussion at the end. We'll leave about 15 minutes for that. What I intend to go through is a review of really some California water facts, just some information of where we are, and then take a look at really some of the earliest water policy in California, which was the creation of the Los Angeles Aqueduct in the early 20th century. And from there, we'll take a look really at how California is changing. And then, of course, we can't really talk about just surface water, so we have to talk about groundwater as well. So I will, and then Dr. Khan, did you get the—
1 sec, Chris. Yeah, just got it. Give me a second.
How many people does it take to share a PowerPoint on Zoom?
Almost there.
Thanks.
All right, we got this squared out. There you go.
Perfect. All right, if we just go to presentation mode, and we can go about 3 slides in.
Yeah.
That's great.
Awesome. All right.
Okay, so, and I'll just say next slide. I apologize. Well, not yet. Go back to the last one.
Sure.
Okay. All right, so looking at California's water, realistically, what we have in the state of California is 2/3 of our water, our rainfall happens in Northern California, and 2/3 of our population lives in Southern California. The reality is most of your water comes from here, the Sierra Nevada mountain range. You'll notice on the western slope, what we really have, Plumas, Sierra, Alpine, Mono, and Inyo County are responsible for the majority of the watershed that's captured and used by Southern California via the Los Angeles Aqueduct. On the eastern slope, we have what's really the Central Valley Water Project, which we'll talk about all these, the State Water Project, and then the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta are all on the western slope of the Sierra Nevada. Next slide, please. So we have really, there's 3 major water transportation projects in California. I'm excluding specifically for this one, the Colorado Water Project, because it's really not watershed from California. But the first was the Central Valley, first that we'll discuss, really the Central Valley Project. That was completed by the federal government in the 1930s, and this is on the western slope of that Sierra Nevada mountain range. The next was the State Water Project, completed by the state government in both the 50s and 60s as the infrastructure came online. And this included both the California Aqueduct and the Delta facilities, most importantly, the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta. And it culminated in the construction of the San Luis Reservoir, which if you haven't seen it is a very worthwhile reservoir to see. It's massive. But then importantly, we had the Los Angeles Aqueduct, which was completed in 1913 and then revamped in the 1960s and 1970s. And we'll take each of these apart. Next slide, please. So you have to consider this. The major water projects were constructed right around the 1960s when California had a population of about 20 million people. Now we have a population of about 40 million people, and our water infrastructure is such that we are still at a level where we can bank and service water at a level for around 20 million people, but we stretch it. That's just what we do to make things work. Examples of aging infrastructure in and around the city of Los Angeles, there's water mains and pipes and water transportation systems that burst on a regular basis, I'd say. Most notably, the one next to UCLA just a few years ago, They let millions of water spill out of a 100-year-old pipe into the streets, and water that's necessary for both life, but had been transported from a place that changed the ecology and environment in that area. Next slide, please. So here we have the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta. And next slide, I'd like to have a picture of it first as we discuss it. So this area, the original inhabitants along the banks were the Miwok and the Yakut people. And this is the reason that we're discussing this is because 80% of all of California water flows through this delta. Now, water is either supplied, meaning it's put to beneficial use, or it simply flows out to the ocean. The rest, about 18% from this area, goes to Central Valley Farms, the breadbasket of the world, or to residents of the Bay Area. Next slide, please. So as to California's surface water, about 48% is restricted to environmental projects. And what I mean by this is really preservation, most often as a result of some lawsuit or some threat of litigation or arbitration through the Department of Water Resources that said, look, this body of water, this estuary, this lake, this river, this delta will not be used and consumed for agriculture, residential, or domestic purposes because there is a beneficial need most often associated or arising from the Environmental Protection Act. The best example of this is the Delta Smelt in Northern California. Now, 41% is allocated to agriculture, which is a significant amount, but it's also one of the largest economic driving factors in the state of California. And then 11% is allocated to cities and domestic uses. Now, I have to say this, that these numbers are disputed. Agriculture users will tell you that they use less. Domestic users will tell you that they use less. It's a fight of two different parties. But when we discuss agriculture, particularly in looking at these large numbers, and I have a link to a video at the end of this from, I believe, the Modesto Irrigation District to sort of provide balance. But agricultural water users will tell you that they take every means necessary to ensure that they're able to use water to its highest and best use, to preserve it, to be good stewards of water, because they understand, as well as everybody in California, that it's a resource of dwindling supply. And cities will say the same, right? It's very easy to look at, say, the city of Los Angeles with the Los Angeles Water Project and say, there's green grass and palm trees everywhere, and water preservation projects don't seem to be a priority. And we'll discuss at the end of this that the city of Los Angeles, as much as we need to heap some discernment upon them because of what happened in the early 20th century, they have taken steps to be good stewards of water. But it's still where our water's used. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the infamous Los Angeles Aqueduct. Next slide. So what is it? I'll go back one slide. I had a picture on there. It may not have populated. Well, I had a lovely picture of the Los Angeles Aqueduct, but I have another one. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so we're going to talk about the story real quick, and it really needs to be told as a story. And if you've taken my class, you know that when we talk about famous legal cases, I like to tell it like a story, so it's not a rote, recital of historical events. But what we have here are characters, people that you've heard of, right? William Mulholland. If you've driven around Los Angeles, you've seen the name Mulholland multiple places. He was the chief engineer and eventually ran the water department for the city of Los Angeles. He worked there at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. Fred Eaton, who also ran the water department in the city of Los Angeles, eventually became the mayor of Los Angeles. Of course, our other characters are going to be the city of Los Angeles and residents of the Eastern Sierras. And I'll note that for the purpose of this presentation, I write Eastern Sierras because we're speaking of the Sierra slopes, both east and west, but their mountain range, the Sierra Nevada, and the Eastern Sierra are usually referred to without the plural. But then important characters here, friends of Fred Eaton and William Mulholland, that includes Los Angeles Times. Next slide, please. So where we are, we're at the beginning of the 20th century. Los Angeles is growing, and it's growing very quickly, and they want to grow more, but they need water resources. So what do they look to? The LA River? Hardly. For most of the year, it's barely a trickle, and that's if you've gotten rain. Groundwater, not a chance. There's not enough there to supply the area, and the groundwater basins hadn't been recharged because of this drought that had existed around that time as well. And so what other sources do they have for water? Well, they decided they would take it. Next slide, please. Okay, go to the next slide, please. I guess my pictures aren't popping. Great picture. Okay. Okay, so what you see to your right, that blue line, that's the Los Angeles Aqueduct. And about halfway up, you see a bubble. That bubble used to be Owens Lake. And I think there's somebody out there that needs to mute. There's a little bit of background noise. Okay, so the blue line, you see that Owens Lake that was completely emptied and, oh, go back a slide.
Sorry. Yeah.
Not a problem. Completely emptied and drained by the Los Angeles Water Project that moved all of the water from the Owens Valley, where Owens Lake was, south into Los Angeles. And you'll see where it shows Los Angeles on that star at the terminus of the Los Angeles Aqueduct. Just to the left of that was an area that was called Owens Mouth. And it was called Owens Mouth because now in the San Fernando Valley, that's where the Owens River, created from the aqueduct from Owens Lake, was now outpouring. That area is now known as Canoga Park. The official terminus of the Los Angeles Aqueduct is over the hill in Sylmar, if you've seen it along the freeway, and there's a large reservoir there as well. But importantly, with the Owens River ending now in the San Fernando Valley, and we'll talk about this as we get there, but the San Fernando Valley was arid, right? As if you've seen it and you know about its history from the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and thereon, absent the drought in the 70s, there were orange orchards everywhere. There were orange orchards everywhere because William Mulholland and Fred Eaton told their friends, hey, we're getting water from the Eastern Sierra. We've tapped this source called Owens Lake. We've turned it into this Owens River now, but we have to put this water somewhere. So we're going to bank it in a groundwater basin underneath the San Fernando Valley. And so all of these people that are friends of the purveyors of this project buy land in the San Fernando Valley and become incredibly wealthy as a result of it, not limited to the owners of the Los Angeles Times who supported the project. Go figure. While we're on this, though, I like to distinguish the Los Angeles Aqueduct, which is often called the California Aqueduct, but it's, I guess, unintentional. To the left on the screen, that red line is the California Aqueduct. You see flows from Northern California, also receives their supply from the Sierra Nevada mountain range. And it flows, there's a couple dots that you'll see there. The two on the left are Pyramid Lake and Castaic Reservoir. And all the way on the right is Paris Lake, which is the terminus of the California Aqueduct. And the other one, which, like I said, not as much up for discussion, the Colorado River Aqueduct. The only thing I'll say about this is that when that was designed, they thought, wow, this is great. We're going to have another gravity aqueduct that's going to take river into Los Angeles. And then a huge rainstorm came through, overwhelmed the aqueduct, and it broke the levees, flooded an area that became what is now known as the Salton Sea, the accidental lake. Next slide, please. So here it is. That's the terminus of the California Aqueduct as it pours over the hill near Sylmar, California. It was near this area where William Mulholland famously said, as he turned on the tap from Owens Lake, there it is, take it. Next slide, please. So here's another view of the California Aqueduct that is helpful to see. It identifies the major reservoir systems along the California Aqueduct, at the top being Lake Oroville, that's had its own trouble within the last few years, particularly in engineering failures, but also the Castaic Lake and Pyramid reservoirs near the West Branch, and finally ending through the Silverwood Reservoir and Lake Paris. So it's on the bottom of your screen right near East Branch where it says Silverwood Lake. That reservoir is, as an aside, but it's a good one to look up as well. They actually flooded an entire town to create that, and it's at some points almost 200 feet deep. Next slide, please. So here again, just to distinguish, this is the California Aqueduct that most people are familiar with, often referred to or thought of as the LA Aqueduct. But these open air aqueduct systems, when it's not open air the entire way, but this is the California Aqueduct, part of the State Water Project. Interesting about this, in places where it is closed, is a massive pumping station where water is pumped over the Tehachapi Mountains in Kern County. Next slide, please. Okay, so Mulholland and the water wars. This is great. William Mulholland, you have to understand this guy's background and how he came to be who he was. So he's an Irish immigrant. He comes to Los Angeles and he's digging ditches for the water department. He finds a fascination with engineering and he becomes a self-taught engineer, which is very important for later in life purposes. But he works for the water department. He befriends the director of the department, which is Fred Eaton, and they work together on many projects. Fred Eaton eventually leaves the water department to become the mayor of Los Angeles. William Mulholland is elevated to the director running the department. It's about this time, well, I mean, I guess it's been happening, but about this time where it becomes incredibly necessary to identify new sources of water for Los Angeles. And Fred Eaton says, look, there was this place I used to visit when I was a kid. It's the Eastern Sierra. There's a beautiful lake up there. But most importantly, this lake is several thousand feet above sea level. So if there were a way to transport the water from there to Los Angeles, we could do it based on gravity alone, which for infrastructure purposes, avoiding the necessity of pumping is incredibly important. So what they do is they devise a system where Fred Eaton, who having now retired from being the mayor of the city of LA, decides that he himself will go into this area of Inyo County where Owens Lake is and the Owens River, and he will buy land adjacent to the river. And this is important, and we'll talk about it here in just a few slides, but for water policy purposes, there's really two ways you get water. And one of them, this was at that time, one of them was living next to the water. If you lived next to the water, you had water rights. So Fred Eaton, former mayor of LA, saunters up to Inyo County and goes to these little farmers and says, well, you know, I've just lived in a big city too much and I'd like to retire and have a cattle ranch. Would you like to sell your ranch to me? And he buys a ranch and then another one and another one. And the locals start to get suspicious. You know, this guy who's from Los Angeles with seemingly unlimited source of funds has come up here and is buying all of these ranches that happen to be adjacent to the water source that all of us, the ranchers, rely on for our livelihood. And so he buys more and more and more until he owns enough so that he can then divert the water. And that's exactly what he does. And they take these water rights that Fred Eaton has essentially bought through deception, right? Like, well, I just want these rights for my farm. No, we're going to transport this water 200 miles away and completely change the ecology and environment in the Owens Valley. It's important to note there were no public hearings before this happened. There was no outreach to the public. It was done incredibly deceptively. And so Mulholland starts building, right? As the engineer, they begin building this open air aqueduct that will now flow the water all the way along the eastern slope of the Sierra, eventually to the city of Los Angeles. Important at this time is that you needed money to be able to do this, and they needed to bond for this so that they could build this aqueduct, which means you needed the support of the LA voters. And so two important things here. One, the LA Times shills for the project because they're friends and associates with Mulholland and Eaton. And they're also clued in, along with Mulholland and Eaton's other friends, that, hey, this water is going to be banked in the San Fernando Valley. So if you buy land there, it'll be worth an incredible amount of money. But this is the second issue. The way that the project was sold to the people of Los Angeles was, look, we will only use this water for the city of Los Angeles. So if we build this infrastructure that we'll bond for, that you will pay for, and transport it to Los Angeles, it'll only be used for the city of LA. Well, if they were going to bank that water in the San Fernando Valley, they needed to do something about it. So they annexed the San Fernando Valley, and it then became part of the city of Los Angeles. Notably, San Fernando Valley tried to back out of the city of LA, I think it was back in the 90s, and their proposition failed. But at the end of the day, people were livid. You know, there was, you know, we talk about just the ranchers that were there. And when I'm saying ranchers, I mean all the people that lived along the Owens River or along the banks of Owens Lake, which was a massive, massive lake, including the indigenous tribes there, that were completely left behind and left with nothing. And people did revolt. Ranchers particularly, they were known to sabotage different developments. They dynamited parts of the aqueduct. And it came to a point where they involved their representative, their U.S. representative, to try to resolve the matter, who was, because of the scarcity in population, the representative was from Kern County. They worked with the Department of the Interior, like, hey, we need to save this lake and this river. And if you've ever driven up Highway 395 through the Eastern Sierra, you will see a massive dry lake bed. Preventative measures weren't put in place to save the lake. Livelihoods of people that were there were forsaken, and the lake was drained. And it's now, like I said, the #1 source of dust pollution in the United States. There have been efforts, and LADWP, to their credit, has worked diligently to work on rewatering the area to prevent the dust storms, I guess is really what you call it, that emanate from there. And so it is a different world. Mulholland at the time was a brilliant engineer, and he did what he had to so that this metropolis of Los Angeles could survive. He ensured that hundreds of thousands of people and eventually millions of people had access to clean water. This is for you to decide, right? The policy decision is, was that appropriate to take the water from the Owens Valley and those people that relied on it? Should they have developed there and around that area? Or is it appropriate to literally take water and transport it thousands of miles? Next slide, please. So this is it. And I referenced it before, but I don't want to say the audacity because, William Mulholland suffered a failure in the end of his life. And you could see he almost became the human that I think most people thought he was. But as he turns on the water flowing down the LA Aqueduct, the audacity of saying, there it is, take it. He's done his job. He's brought the water there, and the environment in California, particularly the eastern slope of the Sierra, is forever changed. Next slide, please. So here's what I'm referencing. The St. Francis Dam, and this is William Mulholland's it's his downfall. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. This was his absolute failure. And again, I'm not disparaging him as an individual, but it was the failure of his career. What happens is Mulholland's saying, look, California, even at this time, early 20th century, we have good years and bad years. Sometimes there's a lot of watershed from the Eastern Sierra that fills the Owens River and Owens Lake that we can then use to provide water to Los Angeles. But there's also bad years. And for those bad years, we need to be banking water. And so Mulholland goes to Fred Eaton and says, hey, when you were buying land, you bought this valley very near Owens Lake. And I think this would be great to store our water, to create a reservoir for our bad years. And Fred Eaton, to his credit, right, looking out for Fred Eaton, one of the things he did is people said, Fred Eaton, you're making so much money buying this land in Inyo County, essentially, the eastern slope of the Sierra, and then selling it back to LA. And he's saying, I'm not making a dime, right? I bought the land, I immediately transfer it for cost to LA. That's what we're doing. We just weren't being honest with people with why we were doing it. Well, now it comes time to build this reservoir that, as we see now, is incredibly necessary for our dry years. And Eaton says, I do have this valley. I'm going to put a couple $1 million premium on it. So that whole holistic approach is completely gone. So Mulholland has to identify somewhere else to put the water. And there's an area through which the water flows, which is San Francisco Canyon in northern Los Angeles County, about 40 miles north of Los Angeles. It's just up from Valencia, between Valencia and Palmdale. And he identifies St. Francisco Canyon and builds a St. Francis Dam. And if you look at this picture here, there's what looks almost like windows at the top of the dam. So William Mulholland himself engineered this dam. Excuse me. He identified the location, he identified the engineering specs for it, and he oversaw the construction of it. And as it was completing, he realized that if he could just add that extra trestle on top where those window-like objects are, an extra 15 to 20 feet, the capacity for storage goes up exponentially. And so he did. But it increased the load on this dam after it had already been built and spec'd up to that size at that point. Next slide, please. So March 12th, 1928, this is what St. Francis Dam looked like. There were reports that there were leaks in the dam. And so William Mulholland and his associate went and surveyed the dam. And they found that it was not an issue. There wasn't a safety concern. And 12 hours later, this happened. Now, I mean, this is important really for us, I mean, we're talking on a California level, but the impact here particularly was incredible for Ventura County. So the St. Francis Dam collapses. The first people to die were likely the dam keeper and his family who lived at the foot of the dam. There were workers at the pump station that's still in this canyon. Some were able to flee, some passed away there as well. But the watershed, this massive amount of water, flows through this dam where the walls caved in until you have just this portion here in the center. And the water flows to the Santa Clara River through the Santa Clara Valley, Fillmore, Santa Paula, Ventura, and it flows out at the Santa Clara River in what is now the city of Ventura. Well, it was then as well. And horrifically, bodies were found there. But this piece here that was left became a tourist attraction, and people were driving to see it. They still had access through the canyon. They're climbing up to the top and taking photos. And so eventually it was taken down. But there is an interesting hike in this area, and there are still remnants of the dam that's very worthwhile to see. Next slide, please. Okay, so we talked about this, and I wanted, this is the big discussion of how water laws worked in California. We're looking at a historical perspective. There's two ways to obtain water rights generally. And when I took water law in law school, we spent 95% of the time learning about riparian rights and prior appropriation. At the very end, the last class or two, they say, well, and then there's California. So the way that in most states, and we learn about Colorado, which is huge, Wisconsin, Vermont, not Louisiana, because they make up their own laws. But most states follow this. Riparian rights mean if you live next to a body of water or a river or a lake, you have a right to use some portion of that water. You buy the land and you get water rights with it. Prior appropriation is a different way of obtaining water rights, whereby you go to a waterway and you put that water to first beneficial use, right? If you're the first person to get there, using it for beneficial use, you have this, what they call senior right. And so what we had in California, particularly here, that Fred Eaton did when he went to the Eastern Sierra, is he looked for people that had riparian water rights and said, I'll buy your land. And just after we're done with the aqueduct, California says, wait, let's fix this. All the water in California that's not federal or tribal is ours, and anybody else can license it from us. So the system changed after that, which is very important. And so California's system is very different, but we do manage water very well. The Department of Water Resources, of course, there's bureaucracy, but we focus well and we're well intentioned with our water. Next slide, please. Well, I think you have my old slide deck here. Go ahead and go to the next one. Next one. Go ahead. Let's see if I have my pictures on there. Okay. This is important. So here we have a look at the California drought between 2006 and 2016. And you look at, I believe that's Imperial County on the bottom, is slightly in drought in 2006. And it comes to 2016, and you have nearly the entire state is an incredible state of drought. Of course, we'll qualify this with things have changed. We have gotten water, but again, California is not particularly great at banking our water. We have some place to do it. We have reservoirs, but they have certain capacities. And when we achieve those capacities, the water's got to be let go, and that water goes to the ocean. But that's not a horrible thing, because there's species, right? There's an environment that relies on that water. We see through what we did with the Los Angeles Aqueduct, that if we take all of the water and move it to one place, you completely change the environment of the place where the water previously was. So we do want water to continue to flow. But importantly here is we are left with, what are we really doing with our water, right? Are we losing so much water when we should be capturing it? And there's two things that I'll discuss here, because I'll finish with this so that we have some time for discussion. But in 2014, I mean, this is 2014, California passes the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And what that did, it solved a long time discussion about what we're doing with our groundwater. Importantly, there was consternation that agriculture was using most of the groundwater in California. So I mean, we're distinguishing here the Los Angeles Aqueduct, which is snow shed and watershed from the Sierras, and California Aqueduct. Again, those are both surface water, but we have our groundwater. At the point where the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act was passed, 85% of groundwater was used by agricultural industry. And people said, wait, we need to do something to regulate this. And so it was really a series of companion bills. It was authored by Assemblymember Roger Dickinson and Senator Fran Pavley. And they passed this law. And I mean, this is incredibly important because it gave us some way to say, we're going to hold people accountable if they let their water tables drop by over pumping. And really what this, and I'll call it SGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, it requires all basins designated by the Department of Water Resources as high or medium priority, meaning their water's at risk. They need to be managed sustainably. And if you're in one of those basins, you have to create a groundwater sustainability plan that says what we're going to do to ensure that our basin is appropriately managed and maintained. Now, there's over 260 groundwater sustainability agencies and over 140 basins, and they're growing. There will be more. One of the ones that I represent, is the Tri-Valley Groundwater Management District in the Benton, Chalfont, and Hamel Valley of the Eastern Sierra. And they are one of these small districts that are monitoring their groundwater. And it's impacted because you have tribal water rights in the area. You have Fish Slough, which is a federally protected area in that area. You have the Department of Water Resources, the LA Department of Water Resources, Department of Water and Power. So there's all these competing interests, and people are using both surface water and groundwater. And what the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act says, okay, for our district, how do we maintain our water? And really part of that is creating this groundwater sustainability plan. You prepare a plan for the portion of the basin that you're responsible for that'll comply with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. You want to ensure that groundwater use and the activities of the users within your district comply with SGMA requirements. And so we require these districts to put together a plan, right? You have to describe the physical settings and characteristics of the basins. And then you have to put together measurable objectives and interim milestones along the way to achieve basin sustainability over 20 years, within 20 years rather. So this includes provisions for monitoring, management of groundwater levels and quality, relationships with surface water, including the flow and quality, groundwater extraction, subsidence, sinking of land, which is a difficult issue for pumping and overpumping, but overdraft and mitigation efforts, as well as recharge and replenishment. And so planning and implementation horizon to achieve sustainability goals is really what you're looking at. How are we going to do this? And the basis of it, and this is the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, while difficult, and there's experts that deal only with that, the crux of it is you need to be good stewards of your water, and you need to have a plan for how you can continue to do that. And it's really been, it's newer. Districts are separating, they're joining each other. But it's helpful. We're doing something with our groundwater. But one of the most important, though, is we're having these districts prepare annual reports, these medium and high priority districts, on groundwater elevation, extraction, recharge. You can do in lieu use, but really, like, what's your basin storage capacity and really your total water use. And then we're periodically evaluating them to determine whether other actions or goals are needed and whether we're actually meeting our goals. So I want to finish off with just a few things. Because I spend some time, when we talk about the Los Angeles Aqueduct, it seems like I'm disparaging the city of Los Angeles or William Mulholland. And you have to be honest to say that bad things did happen. At the behest of a city, people went and lied to people and took their water, right? They bought it from them, but for a purpose that was, the ranchers in the valley never would have sold their water if they knew it was all going to be taken from them. That Owens Lake would one day be gone within 10 years, right? 14 years. Anyway, but they did create Los Angeles. And what I want to distinguish is Los Angeles from then in 1913, when we finished the aqueduct, to Los Angeles County, at least in 2018, because a bigger process now. They passed Measure W when what they did is they were taking a look at, okay, we need to be better stewards of water. And so they built networks, or through this Measure W, they would be able to build a network of small and local rainwater and runoff retention projects. So you don't have big ones, like I said, that completely or could drastically impact an environmental area. But you will have, along with the Measure W, some, it's really anchored by several larger catch basins that are intentionally and thoughtfully created so that we create a limited impact on our environment around us. And then we're looking at, or what they were looking at, is that the groundwater basins in the area were historically underutilized. And it's much more efficient, was Measure W's approach, to divert water into basins than build additional infrastructure. And that's, as we come to the conclusion, is people say, okay, what do we do now? One of the most important things I think that could be proffered from policy position is identifying groundwater storage basins that are fundamentally underused, like Los Angeles County did with Measure W. Because it is more efficient than building the reservoirs, the dams, and the infrastructure that we would need to capture water that we're losing in very wet years like this. But also through, I think, the natural approach to that, we can mitigate the risk. Never again will we dam the Hetch Hetchy Valley, right? Never again will we transport water from one place with a complete disregard for the people that were there, including indigenous individuals with generations in the area, to forsake them for people somewhere else. So being smart and intelligent about our water policy, and really it's knowing the history, right? It's knowing that what was the policy then? The policy then, from Mulholland's own mouth, was, there it is, take it, right? Agriculture users will tell you, and again, I'll preface this with, they make our food, right? They are generally great stewards of water. But from the advocacy position, it's they want a review of the Endangered Species Act so that we can, so that there's more access to water, right? Other groups call for desalinization, which has own environmental impact concerns as well. There's always conservation efforts, right? Must we have green grass everywhere? Must we have palm trees in the middle of a desert? We could always go back to what LA Supervisor Kenneth Hahn proposed in the early 90s, which was we could just tap the Columbia and Snake rivers. We could do the exact same thing to those areas that we did with the Owens Valley and the Owens River, and they tried to do to Mona Lake, had it not been for Martha Davis and the Gaines family that put a stop to it and made LADWP be responsible for themselves. And you see this lake behind me. That's Mona Lake. If you ever have a chance, up the 395, it's stunning, it's historic, it's ancient, and it's still there because people cared about water policy. I have at the conclusion of this, we can send around with the slide deck, and again, I have an updated one. There's 4 resources I would recommend taking a look at. The first is Keep Long Valley Green. It's an organization committed to preserving Long Valley, which is in Mono County. So it's an advocacy group. They have a newsletter called Every Last Drop that discusses what's being done with the water taken from the watershed in the Eastern Sierra. They have a short movie called Without Water. There's also the Mona Lake Committee. They have a Mona Lake story. It's about 30 minutes long, describes what happened, but how they saved the lake and why it was integral and so necessary that that lake was saved, the second largest salt lake in North America. And then I also have, so that I'm not just speaking from the advocacy side, the Modesto Irrigation District has a video, Until the Last Drop, that discusses both water conservation and resource issues, but also the beneficial work of farming and having affordable food as a result of the water that we have in the Central Valley. And finally, I think the best resource available, Cadillac Desert by Mark Reisner from 1986, discusses both William Mulholland, California water policy, the water wars, the Colorado River Project, and really how California's treated water through that period of time. And with that, I'd like to open it up if anybody has any comments or any questions. And I'll say this, I'll work with Dr. Khan to make the slide deck available so that you have it. For those interested, Cadillac Desert was made into a documentary, I believe in the 90s by KTEH, an NPR outlet from San Jose. So it's available there as well for those that don't want to read the book. So I thank you all for listening. My students that are on here have heard me say this so many times. Not once in my life have I been told that I talk too slow. So I believe we were able to get through quite a lot of information in a little bit of time. And I will open it up or turn it back over to Dr. Khan.
Thank you, Chris. That was, yeah, very, very useful information. And we do have a few questions in the chat box. So let's see, let's start with some of them. And if any one of you have questions, please feel free to raise your hand or speak up if no one is speaking. So one question from Ping is, to make sustainable water in Ventura County, what are the issues we should be watching for? Ways to impact its sources, way to maintain or recycle water, generate more water?
You know, I love the question because it's just like, you know, my passion project will always be housing and housing policy. I'm one of those, I believe that housing is a human right. And when people say, you know, how do we fix the housing crisis? The answer is always, there's not one solution. It's the same with water. You know, I think one of the most effective that you can do immediately is conservation, and it needs to be conservation from the top down, our biggest users to our smallest users. But again, you know, here is a point where people like to scapegoat agriculture. And I'm sure it happens in some places, but I don't think it's wholly appropriate, because our agriculture users, like I said, are usually our best stewards, but they're heavy users by the very nature of what they do. Conservation, I think, is key. You know, I always like the approach of ones that don't impact the environment beyond really the necessary footprint that already exists. So something like desalination will impact the environment beyond a footprint that already exists, but I know there are mitigation measures available. Recycling and recapturing water, having permeable surfaces, recharging groundwater basins, and being good stewards of our water are probably our best approach to ensuring that we have good sustainable water supplies in the future.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? I see Hope is here.
Well, there's a comment or a question in the comment section. Will the legislature need to relax environmental regulations to ensure we capture more water as droughts worsen? That's a tough thing. You know, a lot of these surface water basins, there's adjudication has occurred, right? And said, this water is set aside for this, appropriate use for this water is this. And so I'll say this. So one of my clients, the Tri-Valley Groundwater Management District, if I want to change the bylaws for that groundwater district, I have to go through the legislature. And it seems like it's an overly bureaucratic process, but you get to a point where it's like, you know, no, it's helpful that there is oversight, that at the highest level of our government, we have a review of how we're using our water. And I find that to be beneficial. And so if we are going to make any environmental changes, it is going to have to come from the legislature. But most importantly, Mr. Balkin, to your question there, is that the way that we choose to store our water and capture our water can be done in such a fashion that we don't require additional regulation. If you want to build dams, if you want to build canals and reservoirs, you're going to have significant impacts on the environment. If we use what is there and become better stewards, we can mitigate that risk.
Thank you, Chris. We have a question from Murtaza Mogri. So Murtaza, if you'd like to speak up.
So this might be a much longer answer than we have time for, but I think groundwater issues are a big deal. And I've read some stories about private ownership of groundwater systems. Can you talk more about where things are at in the state with groundwater, especially in the Central Valley?
Yeah, and you know, the Central Valley was really the issue. I mean, there are parts of the Central Valley that were anecdotally sinking because so much groundwater is being pumped out of the basin and used really by larger farm organizations, right? And we do have an answer. California did, you know, we legislate very well when it comes to water. You know, for a state that has, it's such a constant issue, our legislatures, I feel, do a very good job in passing the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. We made people accountable, but we also gave local control, which is a very, very popular. We gave local control back to these smaller water districts to say, we will monitor our water. we will put together a plan for our water, and we will report the abuses, and we have an enforcement mechanism available to us. So this is one where we need to compliment California for it. And, it always comes back. When we have the water conversations, people like to disparage the almond farmers because they're such a water intensive crop, or people that flood irrigate rice fields because you don't have to deal with weeds. But again, I caution people, one, not to take the unnecessary stab at agriculture, because they are the easy person to kick around because they are such heavy water users. But you're really lumping everybody in when there are an incredible amount of ag users that work in such a sustainable, monitored, measured fashion, that we become good stewards of water by consuming from farm and agriculture that are good stewards themselves.
Oh, that's an interesting insight. We have time for maybe one or two more questions, so I'll get to them right away. There's a question here on the relationship between available water supplies and housing permits. So your thoughts on that, linking back to your favorite topic. Yeah.
And that's, and I preface that, one of the things I like to do is declare my biases, right? It's like, I believe that water should be made available, affordable, and clean and available to everybody. I also believe that housing is a human right. And so I'm not sure that you can really take those things apart. We forced people into these areas, like Los Angeles particularly, and I said this at the opening, when we took that water from Owens Valley and transferred it to Los Angeles, we said to them, your livelihood is gone. You must now live in one of these city centers. So at what point is it fair for us to say, but you don't get a house? I really think you get to the point of two wrongs don't make a right. If we're going to have the people, we need to have the homes. And if we're going to have the people, we need to have the water. And when you look at the amount of waste that still exists, I don't think we can say yet that you're not allowed to have a house because we don't have water if we're not the absolute best stewards of that water.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Another question on the controversy over alfalfa along the Colorado River.
I'm not familiar with it along that region, but I will say, alfalfa gets a tough rap because it's a water intensive crop, and it's used to feed cattle and other livestock, but really cattle, right? And it depends on where you are, but there's a lot of corn. You go to the Midwest, right? But so the greenhouse gas emission cycle just keeps perpetuating, right? Where it's this water intensive crop, we're using heavy equipment to cull it, and then we're using it on a livestock that has contributed to climate change demonstrably now. And so it's going to be an issue, but until there's an identifiable way to, again, you're talking about housing and water, you need to feed people as well. And until there's an alternative en masse, right, to replace that, it needs to exist to some extent.
All right, thank you. Very practical advice. Last question, I think. Is it necessary to build rainwater storage infrastructure in Ventura County?
This is one of those where you answer a question with a question. Have we fully utilized our groundwater storage basins? And if we have not, I think it's more efficient and we're better stewards of the environment if we store in those areas, as opposed to building additional concrete infrastructure that would impact a place as beautiful as Ventura County.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Khan.
Of course, no, absolutely. So, Chris, let me give you the last word, and then we can close it up on time, perhaps.
Sure. No, and I really appreciate it. Yeah, it's a tough thing to discuss the history of water in California, because what we did at the onset was we took water from somebody and said, this is ours, right? And we created an entire city around it. This is our mentality. And then in the Central Valley, we almost just forsake water and let people just do what they did. But what I'd like to point out, and I hope you see through both Measure W in Los Angeles and the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, is that our legislature and our elected officials are doing things to remedy that, to ensure that we're good stewards of the public trust when it comes to water. And if we continue that, we'll have the ability to have a sustainable water supply into the future.